Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this is our third class in this weekend series on Four Paths to Awaken a Kind Heart. And so we're going to begin with a little bit longer meditation this morning than what we normally do. But let's go ahead and start with just reciting the Four Immeasurables prayer that we've been using before the sessions. And as we go through these, again, we've gone through the first two that are on the screen right now. Try to bring to mind the teachings that I went through yesterday. As we recite these, again, we can visualize all sentient beings surrounding us. You can do that in the way that we did the meditation yesterday afternoon, having your friends, dear ones, in the space to either side and immediately behind you, and then having the difficult people in the space in front of you, sort of facing you. And then surrounding those two groups would be all of the strangers, the people that we don't have a direct connection with in this life, at least at this point. But visualizing those three groups around us, recall the teachings on equanimity, how all of these beings are fundamentally the same, how the relationships we have with them constantly change, how other people perceive the people that we have in various groups in different groups. So there's not really a stable basis for a lot of our attitudes of attachment for friends, hatred for enemies, indifference towards strangers. So again, bring that to mind as we recite the prayer for immeasurable equanimity, and we'll pause after this, extending that wish that all beings have this equal, even-mindedness towards others. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were to abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May they abide in equanimity. I myself will cause them to abide in equanimity. Please, Guru Deity, grant me blessings to be able to do this. And again, feel from your own guru in the form of either Chenrezig or Shakyamuni Buddha, or whatever Buddha that you prefer, as well as you could just even simply visualize your guru in the space above you and receive all the blessings to be able to actualize equanimity within your own mind and to be able to help all others to stabilize their minds in that way as well. Then let's recite immeasurable love. Again, having the thoughts of loving kindness towards all the beings surrounding us, recognizing the various ways that they have shown us kindness, which we'll meditate on shortly. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings had happiness and the causes of happiness. May they have happiness and its causes. I myself will cause them to have happiness and its causes. Please, Guru Deity, grant me blessings to be able to do this. And really wanting every single being to have happiness, all the causes of happiness, all the way up to enlightenment. And want to be the agent to do this. And receive the blessings of the gurus to be able to accomplish this. And then immeasurable compassion, which will be the first topic in the teaching today. Again, generating the thoughts of wishing these beings to be free from all the suffering and everything that causes that, by recognizing that they are all in a state of suffering, no matter who we think about. They're in some measure of not having completed their welfare, not having developed themselves completely. And so we generate that thought towards all of these beings. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they be free of suffering and its causes. I myself will cause them to be free of suffering and its causes. Please, Guru Deity, grant me blessings to be able to do this. And feeling that sense of personal responsibility. And then receiving the blessings from the gurus, to be able to accomplish that. And immeasurable joy, where we kind of share in the joy of others, thinking about them being in this ideal state of completely with happiness, not without even the slightest suffering. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were never separated from the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation. May they never be separated from these. I myself will cause them never to be separated from these. Please, Guru Deity, grant me blessings to be able to do this. Then let's go on to do the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. You can continue to hold the view of the Guru in the form of Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig, or the Buddha, or whatever it is that you're working with as a deity. Or you can simply, again, just think about your gurus, but also think about all the other objects of refuge, all the other enlightened beings, all of our other teachers, the Dharma itself, as well as the Sangha, the spiritual community that supports us on our path because they have deeper realizations than we possess. And that's the sense of refuge that we want to conjure up in the first two lines, really feeling that confidence that the three jewels and the gurus and so on can protect us. And then the second two lines where we meditate on bodhicitta, and we'll again, incorporate that into our meditation on immeasurable love. But for now, just generate that thought that you're here to engage in the Dharma so you can develop yourself completely to the state of Buddhahood and then help others to do the same. Again, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. So let's go ahead then and do a short meditation with the breath, and then I'll lead you in a bit longer meditation again on immeasurable love. Maybe hold on to that visualization of all the beings surrounding you as we begin this meditation. And we'll start with a few minutes of focused meditation on the breath. No doubt you already have a technique that you use with the breath, so you can go to that, use that. If you need a suggestion, generally, again, I suggest working with the area of the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and out, very subtle sensation that occurs right around the tip of the nose or on the upper lip. And then just stay focused on that sensation as best as you can. Try not to let the mind wander. But in any of our meditations, we want to have this factor of introspection, guarding alertness, sort of checking in like a security guard, kind of passing through, just to see, what is the quality of our meditation. If we check in and we see that we're making grocery lists in our head or we're doing something else, gotten caught up in other preoccupations, then at that point we need to correct it. And so we let go of whatever it was that distracted us and gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the chime to begin the meditation period. Do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in the guided meditation. So now to begin our meditation on loving kindness, I think it is really useful for us to generate those thoughts towards ourselves first. And so begin with thinking about the fact that just like all these beings that you're visualizing surrounding you, you yourself have that same starting point, that same desire, the wish to be happy, the wish to not suffer. And in this way, you then are equally deserving of happiness. And begin to turn your attention to yourself, thinking about the fact that, yes, we do have faults, each of us. We have shortcomings, but we're worthy of love. We're worthy of being accepted just as we are. And really feel thoughts of friendliness towards yourself, and not having any sort of resentment at the fact that you're not living up to ideally what you'd like to be. Once more, having that sense of acceptance, just like a good friend would never criticize you, but would rather help you, be there for you, support you, nurture you. And moreover, acknowledge that you have the potential to grow and to change, to experience greater and greater happiness and peace and the fulfillment of all of your potential, the development of all your positive qualities. Just really feel good about yourself. This is a part of loving kindness towards ourselves, that each of us is a work in progress, moving towards that goal of enlightenment, and we can embrace ourselves wherever we're at in that process of development. And really wish for yourself to be able to fulfill your deepest happiness, to achieve your greatest potential. And then bring voice to that thought by saying to yourself, you need not say it out loud, but generating these thoughts towards yourself. May I be happy. May I be safe and free from any danger or harm. May I have all that I need, all the causes and conditions to be able to be truly happy, to be peaceful, to be completely satisfied. May all my thoughts and actions be positive and all my experiences good. And whatever other thoughts you want to generate towards yourself, think those now. Thoughts of loving kindness, friendliness, a wish for you to be truly happy. And imagine that the warm energy of loving kindness in your heart radiates out, filling your body, your mind, helping you to become completely suffused with happiness and its causes. And then to do the meditation where we extend this beyond ourselves, let's begin with taking one person from each of the three groups. One person who is in the group of your friends, your dear ones, perhaps the one you feel closest to, be an easy place to start to practice loving kindness. And someone who's among the sort of nameless group, the strangers. Here again, you might pick someone who you see at the grocery store or around town, somebody who you've maybe had just very minor contact with. You don't have any particular feelings towards them. And then choose one of the difficult people. You might not start with the most difficult person. Rather, you might start with somebody who has been some irritation to you or to those that you love. You have some feelings of ill will towards them, but not, maybe the most difficult person that you can think of. But it's up to you. Again, choose 3 people you're comfortable working with in this loving kindness meditation. Now, we're going to first just do a short equanimity meditation by thinking about the sameness of these 3 beings. In spite of the fact that they're manifesting in different roles for you right now, every one of these beings is the same in wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer. Every one of these 3 beings is the same in having some good qualities and some bad qualities. They might be in different amounts within each of these people, but nonetheless, every one of them has something good about them, something that's not so good about them. And moreover, every one of these 3 beings is the same in having the potential to develop their minds completely. They all have Buddha nature. So in this way, all 3 are worthy objects of our thoughts of loving kindness and generating those towards them. But nonetheless, we might need to do a little more work to feel comfortable, extending that loving kindness to them. So within some measure of equanimity, let's begin with the friend, the dear one in our life that we've chosen to work with, and think about all the ways that they have been kind to you. No doubt they've been very directly and intentionally kind, doing a lot of things that have contributed to your welfare. And just take a minute or so to acknowledge those things. They should come to mind fairly easily. And within that understanding of the ways they have shown us kindness, extend out thoughts of loving kindness towards this person, generating thoughts like, may you be happy and have all the causes of happiness. May you be safe, free from danger, at ease, at peace. Whatever thoughts come to mind, just cultivate them and send them out, opening your heart with loving kindness, even feeling that warm energy from your own heart extending out and filling them. Then let's turn our attention to the stranger. This, again, may be somebody who works in stores where you shop or what have you. But even if you don't know what that person does, where they work, what they do, we can also feel some closeness to them because we see how we are benefited from them. And in that way, they have shown us kindness. This person may be somebody who does help to produce the food or sell the food, package the food that you partake of. Might be somebody who is involved in other businesses, other things that contribute to your welfare indirectly. This being is sort of behind the scenes, but there are many like this stranger who are playing this role. So as we think of that one person, we can think of all of those who are, contributing to your welfare in that indirect way, in a very unintentional way. They're not thinking of you specifically, but nonetheless, you benefit. So reflect on their kindness. That is a bit behind the scenes, but we can acknowledge it because we have received benefit from this person and others like this stranger. And as you feel the gratitude from those beings who play that role, send out to this one being, this stranger that is before you, thoughts of loving kindness, thinking, may you too be happy and have all the causes of happiness. May you be at peace. May you be truly content. May you be at ease. Again, use whatever thoughts work for you, sending out that warm energy of loving kindness from your own heart to that being in front of you, that stranger. And then lastly, turn your attention towards the difficult person or enemy, the person who has harmed you or those that you love in some way. You feel some ill will towards them generally, but we're going to work on generating thoughts of loving kindness. So we have to reframe here even greater how we see kindness from this person, because this person has been intentionally and oftentimes directly harmful towards us, has said things or done things to upset us or those that we love. So how are they showing us kindness? Because we need people like that to deepen our own ability to remain undisturbed in the face of harm, to practice patience and tolerance, to continue to open our hearts in the face of those adverse situations. We need difficult people in our lives. They don't intend to benefit us, but we can be benefited from their presence. So reflect on how this being is giving you this precious opportunity. So rare. We don't have that many people that fit in that category in our lives, hopefully. They're rare beings. And when they come into our lives, they bring that gift with them. Their presence, their actions, their words can help us to become more patient and tolerant. And then begin to generate what thoughts of loving kindness you can towards that being. Might be challenging, but again, recall how this being is seen differently by other people, has the same potential that you possess, Buddha nature, and so on. And there's so many things that we can reflect on that can give us some confidence that these thoughts of loving kindness aren't unfounded. This being too deserves happiness. And so begin to generate those thoughts of, may you be happy. May you have each and every cause of happiness. May you know true peace. May you be genuinely content. Again, whatever words work for you, spend another minute or so sending out that loving kindness, that warm energy from your own heart to that difficult person. And then by extension, begin to send those thoughts of loving kindness out to all the other beings in those three groups, to all the other friends, dear ones, all the other strangers, all the other difficult people. Think, may all of you be happy. May each and every one of you find all the causes that will bring you to temporal and ultimate happiness. May you know true peace. May you be at ease. May you be happy. And feel that loving kindness in your own heart, that warm energy pervade all the realms of beings, all the beings that we're visualizing, wherever there are beings. They are touched by that warm energy of loving kindness. And they experience the peace and the happiness that we wish for them. And then seeing that while we've done this in our own imagination, in our own meditation, we have not yet achieved this, but we can develop ourselves to be able to benefit all beings in this way, to be able to place them in happiness through helping them to know the causes of that and practice that. We can free them from suffering by helping them to know the causes of suffering and to avoid and eliminate those. We can help beings to an even greater degree if we develop ourselves fully. So therefore, we're going to continue our exploration of these four immeasurable thoughts today with that motivation of bodhicitta that is inspired by loving kindness and compassion on the basis of equanimity and with a mind of joy, thinking that we are here today to develop ourselves so we can help others most completely, most perfectly. And hold on to that thought of bodhicitta that is the best motivation to bring to these teachings and to one's life. Okay, good. So I hope that was nice. It's again nice to start the day with maybe a little bit longer meditation. So I hope that was okay for everyone. Any questions or comments on the meditation or on what we talked about yesterday in terms of immeasurable equanimity and immeasurable love? Anything anyone needed to bring up? Okay. Well, then let's get back into it. Let's go ahead and dive in. I don't know that there was much more that I needed to say on loving kindness. One thing I did want to make sure that I didn't mention yesterday, and I was going to mention it today in relation to compassion, is that sometimes we take these ideas, we can start with sort of love and compassion, and then we talk about immeasurable love and immeasurable compassion. But remember that third line that we recite in the prayer that says, I myself will cause sentient beings to, be in happiness and the cause of happiness, whatever the exact wording is. When we take that personal responsibility and we say, I myself will do that, that's where we elevate it again to what is called great love and great compassion. These are what the Mahayanas, the Bodhisattva, practices, is generating that strong motivation that's not just content with wanting others to have that. It's a perfectly fine thought. And again, in the Theravadan tradition, they very much practice this, is wanting all beings to have that through that thought of may they be happy, may they know the causes of happiness, the things that we were doing in this meditation. But we always want to get to that place where we take personal responsibility, which is what we did at the end of the meditation today as well, because that's where it becomes great love. Great love isn't content with just wanting others to have it. It's saying, I myself will do that. It's sort of a combination of that altruistic resolve, as well as the culmination of our thoughts of loving kindness towards others, that we're not content just wanting them to have that. We're going to do something about it. We're going to roll up our sleeves and get to work and, place beings in that state. So we're going to talk about that in regard to great compassion as well. Great compassion is that wish that we actually become the agent to help others to be free from their suffering. We aren't content to simply just want them to be free from suffering. So let's get the slideshow going here. Again, I'm not going to share too many slides today. We're going to start with what we did yesterday, which was on your handout as well. This is the bit of quote from Kathleen MacDonald in her book about the Four Immeasurables called Awakening the Kind Heart. It's a really sweet book, and I think at the back it has even some teachings on the 8 verses of thought transformation. She's such an amazing teacher. I've met her a few times. She's really very, very special person. So anyway, little plug for her book, but there are a number of good books about the Four Immeasurables out there, but maybe I'll talk about that at the end. Compassion arises out of our own experience of suffering. This is why, once more, just like we did with love, we started with self-love. It's important that we start with self-compassion. We have to acknowledge our own suffering and develop compassion, and then we can, extend that to others. She says, we all know what it's like to be sick or in pain, to be lonely or have our feelings hurt by an unkind remark, to fear the unknown or grieve the death of a loved one. Maybe we don't all have complete knowledge of everything that any being has suffered, but we can imagine. This is, what our empathy, we're not going to talk so much about empathy this weekend, but empathy, certainly when it comes to compassion, is what is a sort of necessary component for us to be able to generate compassion. We have to have some sort of understanding of the suffering that others are going through and the ability to sort of take that on. Empathy is that idea of sort of being in the other person's shoes so that we then can relate to them. We have to make sure that that empathy doesn't become overwhelming for us. We're going to talk about overwhelm as part of the teachings on compassion, because this is where there is that potential for us to sort of feel the heaviness of it. I know that when the coronavirus pandemic started and they were getting all these pictures from the hospitals in New York where it was exploding in particular, it was just kind of hard to sit with that and to take all of that in and to be kind of keep your empathy going in the space of that. And then of course the compassion gets blocked if the empathy isn't there. But we have our own way through our human, again, imagination, intellect, understanding, that we can feel what others are feeling to some degree. Not that we have the exact thoughts and the exact experience. Everyone has their own unique experience, but we have something that is similar, that can be triggered and that can be brought into the situation so that we can enlarge our hearts at that moment. So she's not saying that we all have identical experiences of suffering and therefore there's nothing that we would be blind to or unable to feel. It's just that any of these ways that she's talked about here are doorways through which we can identify with the suffering of others. When we then see or hear of others going through similar experiences, our heart opens with a feeling of empathy and the wish to help. This is compassion, the wish for oneself and others to be free of suffering, free from all painful, unwanted, unsatisfactory experiences. It acknowledges that everyone wants to be free of suffering, deserves to be free, and has the capacity to be free. So this is what we saw again in terms of yesterday when I was talking, I read a little passage from her book about the various types of happiness, and she was saying in there yet, that there is that concept that everyone really deserves to be happy. I mean, it's a weird word to use in some ways because, again, based on the karma that beings create, they're unfortunately not even able to experience temporal happiness a lot of the time. But in that sense, they haven't created the causes for it, but nonetheless, it's sort of their birthright to be able to achieve that happiness, grounded in the concept of Buddha nature, that they have the potential for that. Every being, sort of at the core of their being, is this pure, pristine mind that can experience unbelievable bliss and well-being. But right now, it's just clouded and obscured. All the various things are there that are keeping that realization and that experience from happening. So, sort of the birthright of all beings, by way of them having a mind that is fundamentally pure, that can be developed into the state of Buddhahood. Remember, we talked about this yesterday, Sangye, complete purification of all what obscures the mind, all the negativities that cause our suffering, as well as the deeper imprints of that. And we can develop Gye, all of the positive qualities that bring about a real, genuine sense of well being. Everything we're talking about this weekend is that type of work of developing yay. But as I was pointing out yesterday, we also then are purifying to a large degree, because anytime we bring up these positive emotions, we are directly counteracting the negative ones. So again, when we look at this mind of compassion, it's about seeing sentient beings through that lens, that they too are just like us and having this mind that is fundamentally pure, that is obscured for the moment, and can be completely purified and all the good qualities completely enhanced. We all have that same potential. So let's go into then the handout and kind of go through the various parts of that. So this is the page for this. I think it's page 3. Is that right? Yeah, page 3 at the bottom. The points for meditating on immeasurable compassion. So again, as I said earlier, we're going to start with ourselves. The whole topic of self-compassion is actually a really big one. Maybe it's like this year's mindfulness or last year's mindfulness. I don't know what this year is. This year, I don't know. With the pandemic going on, who knows what the the big word is in the Buddhist circles? But self-compassion got to be a pretty hot topic because of a lot of the research that was being done as well in the scientific field around self-compassion and the benefits of that. And so people like Kristen Neff, who's written a wonderful book on self-compassion, she has these nice little exercises that you can do that are a bit similar to what we're going to be doing here. But we really do need to begin by turning our attention to ourselves, to sort of accept the reality of our own suffering and to recognize that compassion for ourselves is where it all starts. How can we have genuine compassion for others if we haven't looked at our own mess, in a sense, our own difficulties, our own suffering, and generated those compassionate thoughts? So the very first step in this is to consider how you are the same as all beings in wanting to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Could take a straw poll right now. Is there anybody, in our little Zoom room here that wants to suffer and wants to have the causes of suffering? Raise your hand now. No. So we're all identical in that way, right? There is nothing different between myself and anyone else. And even an insect or a field mouse or whatever it is that we come across in our day, those beings also don't want to suffer. We can see it because when they are threatened with something that will endanger their well-being, they immediately go the opposite direction, right? They want nothing to do with that. They don't want to be harmed. They don't want to be frightened. They don't want to, be at risk. So every being is just like that. And we ourselves are just like that. We have to be willing to accept that reality of kind of our own vulnerability, in a sense, that we have that wish to not suffer, but nonetheless, each of us does suffer. So let's go back to the sheet there. Generate an attitude of compassion for yourself, wish for yourself to not suffer, remembering the following. Going into your heart, get in touch with this fundamental wish that you possess, the desire to be free from suffering and its causes. That's just kind of getting in touch with that and saying, I too, every day of my life, I don't want to experience what is unpleasant, what is difficult. And again, you might listen to some of these teachings and you go, well, but the other night, weren't you telling me that I should learn to like my problems and my suffering? Well, that's it within a different training here. I mean, this is a training to help us to connect with others and to generate genuine compassion. And once more, when we use that idea that we used the other night of learning to like problems, it's within the context of eventually getting rid of all of our problems and suffering. It's not like you're going to have problems and suffering forever. Once you develop your mind fully and you attain the state of Buddhahood, you don't have any problems then. There's no suffering in that mind of or experience of that being. So nonetheless, the goal is the same for each of these, or just different techniques. So secondly, recognize that this is something you share with all beings. Feel this sincerely and do not think that it is somehow wrong to feel this way. Instead, see it as your right as a living being to be free from all suffering. It's sometimes really hard to generate these thoughts towards ourselves, but to recognize, because I myself, when I came to the Mahayana path and to the Tibetan Buddhist teachings, I was very much in that mode of like wanting to care for others. I spent a lot of time in San Francisco during the 80s with the HIV epidemic into the 90s. I didn't leave there till it was like 1998, but I met Buddhism earlier on in the 90s. And I was very much coming from that place of identifying very strongly with this Tibetan Buddhist orientation towards the compassion that wishes to benefit others. But I don't think I'd done very good work on myself and generating genuine compassion for myself. And so it's always a little, and I do think that that is one of the obstacles for people who are in caregiving professions or who are doing that type of work day in and day out, is that they need to embrace themselves with greater self-care and self-compassion and all of that. And then they have an ability to do that work much more effectively, in my estimation. And of course, we have to recognize that there are some things that can become obstacles. Obviously, we're going to go into those when we talk about the near enemies of compassion, just like we talked about the near enemies of the other two immeasurables yesterday. Those are kind of where the problems start to arise. But nonetheless, if we get in touch with compassion for ourselves, really genuinely, it's very easy then to extend that to others because we know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that then. Unfortunately, there are some people who haven't lived lives where they've experienced great compassion or love from, others in their lives, their parents or what have you. This does happen in our world. And so they might not have experienced it from others, and they need to generate it for themselves before they can really know it and extend it out to others. But we have to spend some time doing this work. I know a lot of people I talk to who are Buddhist practitioners have a very difficult time sort of putting themselves as the focus because we like to think that we're here to work on others, to help others, to be a benefit to them. That was what appealed to me in regard to the Tibetan Buddhist teachings. Then we go on to the third step, acknowledge your potential to experience true freedom from all forms of suffering, keeping in mind the Buddhist teachings on the various types of suffering, which I'll go into in a moment. But this idea of the potential to know freedom from that, that's because everything that the Buddha taught in the Four Noble Truths speaks to the reality that our suffering isn't permanent, it isn't cast in stone, it isn't unchanging. Suffering arises. This is, again, we'll go back and review the Four Noble Truths because I think this is a good place to introduce them. The Buddha focused on suffering as part of this, but of course his definition of suffering is much greater, as we're going to look at in a moment. But essentially in the First Noble Truth, the Buddha was pointing out how we are in an unsatisfactory situation. The Sanskrit word for this is dukkha. Dukkha literally means an axle that's not in the well properly, so that you have a bumpy ride. If you can think of an axle and the wheel's not sitting on it properly. So everything is really, really bumpy, and it continues to be bumpy because the axle is not in the right place. The opposite of this is sukha, which is, of course, usually defined as sort of joy or the joy of Buddhahood. Sukha is when everything's smooth, no more bumpy rides. We're on this smooth ride because we're no longer creating the causes and conditions for this unsatisfactory state. So we'll talk in a moment about what is meant more about this first noble truth that is often called the truth of suffering. But again, we have to think about suffering being much larger than that. The second noble truth is that there are causes for that. They often compare this to like a good doctor. So the very first thing when you go to a doctor is you want the doctor to tell you if you're well or not. Maybe they've run all your blood work and the doctor comes in and says, First Noble Truth. I hate to tell you, but you're suffering from this illness. And you go, why is that happening? What's behind all of that? That's the Second Noble Truth. Why we are suffering or why we have dukkha is because we've created the causes in our own minds. The main two causes are our karma and our delusions. The karma is the more direct cause of our unsatisfactory experiences, because all of that arises from the actions we've committed, our verbal actions, our physical actions, but mostly our mental actions. And the mental actions are always together with some form of distortion, which could be the deeper delusion of ignorance, but also can manifest with attachment and anger and all the various things that are part of the delusions. We can even have some wholesome states of mind together with that ignorance. But as long as it's conditioned by ignorance, as long as the root cause is there, the root delusion of ignorance, all of this is going to be tainted. It's all going to simply give rise to experiences within samsara, within the First Noble Truth of this dukkha, this unsatisfactory existence. So this is the first two truths. Again, the Buddha being the good doctor, saying, hate to tell you, but you're not well. That book, I'm okay, you're okay, the Buddha's actually saying, you're not okay, but I'm okay. And I can tell you how to get okay. That's the second two truths, is that the Buddha says in the Third Noble Truth, you can have an end of dukkha, and you can get rid of all the causes of dukkha. This is what we're reflecting on here in regard to ourselves. We'd like to think that all of the stuff that's in our minds is kind of, it's taken roost there, and it's not going to ever sort of move out. It's like roommates that move in and never move out. We like to think that that's what's going on, but we can address those things. They can change. A lot of people, I think I mentioned this the other night, they kind of think of themselves as angry people. Maybe that was last Monday when I was talking to the patients group. But anyway, we aren't angry people. We are people who have anger that arises based on various causes and conditions. All of that can be undermined. Causes and conditions can change. That's the whole import of the Four Noble Truths, is that Buddha says things can change. You don't have to experience dukkha and the causes of dukkha. You can experience an end to your dukkha if you create the causes for that end. That's the Fourth Noble Truth, the truth of the path, the realizations, the consciousnesses, the awarenesses that will lead you out of that state of dukkha into sukha, or into, a state where you have attained some peace and happiness and well-being, because you're no longer under the control of those factors. So all of this can be accomplished because of its impermanence. In a nutshell, there are many other reasons that we can look at as to why it's possible to get rid of all of these, but I'm not going to go into that so much today. The import of this is to recognize that you don't have to continue to suffer. You don't have to continue to be in this conditioned existence. All of this is subject to change if we create the causes for change. It's not going to change on its own. It's not like the weather that just, suddenly, one day the clouds move in and it starts raining, and then we have a cooler front and then it gets warm again or whatever. Everything is changing on the basis of the actions that we engage in, that we create the causes for our own change. And then let me finish off this, and we'll go to that addendum 2 to this document that shows the points for meditating on the suffering of sentient beings. Give yourself the space to fulfill that potential of being free from all suffering and the causes of suffering, truly wishing yourself to have that. And then again, you hold that thought in the space of these ways that are affirming that, saying things to yourself like, may I be free from suffering? May I be free from pain and sorrow? May I be free from all the causes of suffering, karma and delusions? May I be liberated from these? May I, be liberated from all that obscures the mind. Whatever works for you. Again, that's the language that can be very personal. But this is you saying this to yourself after having done, kind of meditated, reflected on the previous points. And then imagine yourself in this state of freedom, peaceful, joyful, full of positive energy to benefit others in the world, free of any problems, difficulties, what have you. So this is where, again, it might be a good time to go ahead and, well, actually, we're getting pretty close to the top of the hour, but let's go ahead and start. We'll go down to that. Again, I'm sorry if I make people dizzy when I do this, but addendum 2, which is on page 9 at the bottom. Most of it's on the following pages. In this meditation, we can recall the various types of suffering that are presented in the Buddha's teachings in order to enhance our compassionate wish to free all beings from all of these without exception. again, because of the way the Buddha taught various, presentations of suffering, there's a lot that we could meditate on. I'm going to focus on the first three, which most of you have heard before, the idea of the three types of dukkha or suffering. Again, I do have a footnote on that that indicates where you will find, teachings on those in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, which is perhaps one of the most common Lamrim texts that people have, since it's used extensively in the FPMT. But again, I'm using the word suffering there. Maybe I should have changed this before distributing this document, because these days I'm preferring to use the word dukkha, because when we use the word suffering in English, it does have the connotation of the first of these, the suffering of suffering, or the dukkha of pain. Those experiences of pain or anguish that are clearly unpleasant and unsatisfactory. There's no question about it. Again, any being, any human being, any animal will clearly identify that as suffering. Now, again, the one thing about this form of suffering is that it is the easiest to recognize, but therefore it also is the easiest to trigger in ourselves compassionate thoughts. But we shouldn't neglect the others that we're going to go into, but nonetheless recognize that this is a way that we can get in touch with the suffering of others. Like I mentioned earlier, when the coronavirus pandemic really broke in the US and we're having those shots from the hospitals and the hospital workers and all of what they were dealing with, when you see people in that level of distress, and you think about people having to be cordoned off from all of their loved ones and possibly dying alone, or with just hospital staff around rather than any family members or what have you, it kind of breaks your heart to be in touch with all of that. But that's because that's the first level of suffering. It's sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's the easiest to see, but it does then have a direct impact on us. Because if we can, and there are some people who have a hard time even opening to that little tip of the iceberg, who have a difficulty with being with others because they don't have the empathy, or because they're frightened and distressed by seeing suffering and so on. So, again, congratulate yourself on whatever, ability that you have to identify the suffering of others. But, we also are suffering in that way. We may not be suffering right now. I would guess that most of you probably aren't having any major suffering, though maybe you've got a headache, or you've got something going on with your body, or maybe you've had something recent in your life that's still plaguing you mentally. Grief is in this category. Any other mental anguish is in this category. Here again, we're mostly going to start by talking about our own selves and identifying how we have that level of suffering in our lives. Not constantly, most of us, I hope. There are human beings who do have that constant pain in their lives due to some condition or what have you. But most of us have these on occasion, and they are good places to recognize where we can identify with our own suffering and our wish to be free of that. But we have to go deeper than that. So let's go on to these other two, and then we'll take a break when we've gone through these. I think that'll be a good place to stop. The suffering of change, or dukkha of change. This refers to those experiences that we identify as pleasure or happiness, but are actually in the nature of suffering, because they do not last, nor do they provide long-term satisfaction or freedom from our problems. So this is pointing to the nature of these experiences that we actually think are happiness. And of course, it's a label we're putting on that because it's contrasted so greatly against the first type of experience, the pain, the displeasure, the difficulty, that we actually get a little confused. And most beings in this world are confused in thinking that when they get something that induces some measure of pleasure or happiness, they've actually gotten some true happiness. Well, the Buddha is saying, fine to identify it as happiness. Don't have a problem there. That's just a conventional way of talking about it. But it's really just temporal happiness. It's not ultimate happiness. In fact, if we examine it further, we see how unsatisfactory it is. That's why, again, it's better to maybe use this word dukkha, because dukkha is referring to the imperfect state that we're in, that where these things are unsatisfactory. So sometimes the analogy or the example that I use for this is the example of, well, Venerable Bina likes chocolate cake, but we can use whatever cake. We'll just say birthday cake, and you can fill in the blank. Maybe you like carrot cake for your birthday, or maybe you like lemon cake for your birthday, whatever. So let's use this idea of birthday cake. So you had pleasure. Let's say if you can remember the first time you went to a birthday party, maybe it was your birthday party, and you tasted that birthday cake and you had that joy of all of that. I mean, the first thing is, did that last? Are you still experiencing the joy of that piece of cake right now? If I were to offer you a piece of cake, if I could possibly do that through the online connection, if I were able to offer you a piece of cake and you were able to say, no, I'm still experiencing the joy of when I had cake when I was 4 years old or something. Well, then that would be evidence that it actually does, it's sustainable. It actually does produce something that we can rely upon as a ongoing source of happiness and well-being. But it doesn't, right? None of us can say that. Every one of us has had zillions of pieces of cake, maybe not zillions, but a lot of pieces of cake since that first one that we had. By the way, if you don't like cake, use pie or whatever it is that works for you. But this is one piece of evidence that this is not actually satisfactory. And you may say, well, but what's the big deal, Don? I mean, we all know this. Everybody knows that pieces of cake, you eat them and you get a temporary, joy out of it. And then you eat another one the next day or later that day and you get some more joy out of it. That's just the nature of things. Well, the Buddha is saying the nature of things is that they're not really satisfactory. And of course, it's being contrasted with the reality that you can experience ultimate happiness. Those are, again, the last two truths, that you can know a state of deeper peace, well-being, satisfaction at the deepest level. And we're blind to that because we get caught up in these pleasurable experiences and we think that they're everything that we're looking for. And all the pleasurable experiences that we've had through our senses or through our mental awareness, thinking about things, enjoying things, none of it amounts to anything. And when we get to the end of this life, it's all gone, completely over. Yeah. All those experiences of happiness, if we didn't do anything meritorious with them, they were just passing experiences that we got caught up in and maybe even developed greater attachment to. But another thing that kind of points to, the reality of this is the example that they often use, which is if you think that cake is a true source of happiness, well, then try eating a number of pieces of it in a row and see if it creates greater and greater happiness. Maybe we did that at that birthday party that I was referring to earlier as well. We sat down and we said, oh, wow, this birthday cake is really good. I'm going to have another piece. And, they're all little pieces laid out on the paper plates. And so you go grab another one and you eat that and you go, wow, that was good. I'm still enjoying it, but and then eat a third piece. And then maybe by the time you get to like the end of the third piece, you're almost sick, and then you might even vomit because, you've eaten too much cake and ice cream or whatever, all these various things that kids overeat on. Uh, they don't lead to greater happiness. Hate to tell you folks, but as much as we enjoy all these various things in our life, we've deluded ourselves into thinking that they're actually causes of real happiness. And so we keep going and we sort of change it up. We do things in moderation. We have just enough cake to make us feel good, not so much to make us feel sick. And then we wait the proper amount of time before we have something else we'll enjoy as food. And then in the meantime, we enjoy some music and we don't listen to the same piece of music 18,000 times in a row. We put on something else and then we maybe go to watch TV and then you go out for a walk and then you go do this and you go do that. And you do all these things that look like happiness and look like you're staying in a state of happiness, but no single one of those is capable of producing the ultimate happiness that you seek and cannot be sustained. As enjoyable as it is to listen to a piece of music, try listening to it, 50 times in a row. Your favorite song right now, whatever it is, put it on and put on repeat and just listen to it. And you'll probably be sick of it by, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times, maybe a little bit more, depending on, what the music is. I don't know. Okay, so this is the second level of dukkha, is the recognition that even these things that we have come to rely upon as happiness do have an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. They're unsatisfactory. Let's go to the third one. I think we'll do that and then we'll do our break. The third one is the deepest level and actually the most difficult to realize, it said, pervasive conditioned dukkha, or sometimes Rinpoche calls this pervasive compounding, like compounding interest. Like every day you get more interest on the account plus the interest on the interest. It just keeps compounding our problems. But conditioned works as well, because we are recognizing here that we are under the control of various factors. We are conditioned by our karma and delusions. So this pervades all of our existences. This is sort of 24/7 dukkha. Our very existence in samsara, which is due to our minds being under the control of our karma and delusions. As long as we are in this state where those are what are sort of taking charge of things, what we are having to experience the effects of, well, then we are not going to be in a satisfactory existence. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I think it was the very first teaching I ever had from him in San Francisco in 1996. And he said, I didn't understand maybe like 90% of what he said. At that time, he actually cleared his throat a lot. At least that was the karma I had, to hear his teachings with a lot of throat clearing and a few words between the throat clearings. And I was trying to pick up what he was saying and what the meaning of it was. And I really wasn't getting that much. But the one thing that stuck with me from that night was when he said, there are no vacations in samsara. This pervasive conditioned dukkha is pointing to that fact. You are never on vacation, really. You never get a break. As long as you've got karma and delusions behind the scenes as an impetus for each unfolding moment, well, then you're going to have some level of dissatisfaction. Things are not okay until we've gotten rid of all those causes. Of course, this is the deepest one that we need to realize with ourselves, because we need to see that in spite of the fact that I can look at my life right now and think, oh, I'm relatively well off, doing okay. I'm not starving. I'm not out on the street. I'm doing all right. I'm not ill at this time, at least as far as I know, knock on wood. All of these things, we can look at ourselves and we can actually feel pretty good about our situation. But we have to go deeper. And that's where the second type of suffering, or dukkha, is to help us to go deeper, to see that even what we have that are those satisfactory experiences, the way that things are going well and things are good, isn't really something we can rely upon. Don't put all your money there. That's because each of us is conditioned in this way. Under the control of our karma and delusions, we continue to experience this unsatisfactory state, this state of cyclic existence, samsara, the dukkha that we experience, which is this unsatisfactory existence. So, all right, so let's go ahead and take a short break there. If you have some questions, maybe again, you can put them in the chat box or write them down during the break, and we'll be sure to come back to them when we return. Let's go for, why not 11:15? Give everybody a little bit of a stretch break. So at 11:15, we'll resume. And again, if you have any questions at that time, we can go into that. All right, I'll see you shortly. So are there any questions or comments on what I've talked about so far in regard to compassion, especially with regard to the three types of suffering? Anyone?
Hi, Don. This is
Hi,
Heather.
Heather.
So the issue is not so much that, so the cake does make you happy, or quote, it's just to not believe that it will last. Or so, for example, last night when sleeping in my air conditioning, I'm quite positive that made me happy. But I don't believe that is ultimate happiness, or the only, you know what I'm saying? So I don't know how to relate to.
Yeah. I guess again, when we look at it from the point of view of having that understanding, can help to diminish some of the delusions we might have around those things, which could be, again, the ignorance, thinking that as long as we have all of these things, we're going to be fine. Because we do kind of tend to put all of that onus on those things then. And then when we don't have them, we get bent out of shape. And of course, while we do have them, we get quite attached to them. So if we can undermine some of that process through having that understanding, that's great. But I guess, it also boils down to just the general thing, the sort of approach that people have to their lives, where they think that if they just keep getting all the good stuff, that's good enough, that will satisfy, make it kind of a good life. Well, that's not really a good life. That's a life, in a sense, that's just kind of wasted, getting fleeting moments of transitory happiness that don't really amount to anything. One's not using it in a meritorious way at all. Yeah. If we look at it from the point of view of karmically, well, everything that you have, you had the good karma, well, maybe you had the negative karma to start with, of getting here and having the heat and the being very oppressive and not being able to deal with, all of that, which many people are dealing with here as well as other places. And then you had the good karma ripen to have the guy come and say, yeah, I'll put in an air conditioning unit in your window, and now you have a nice night's sleep, and I'm sure you'll have, better sleep going forward and be more comfortable during the day. So it's all a karmic creation. But if we just simply, if we look at it from like we don't get like any sort of karmic statement at the end of each month, detailing out how many withdrawals you made and how many deposits you made, how much good merit you threw in and how much you drew out in terms of all the good experiences you had. But everything that we have that arises in the form of a pleasant experience comes from good karma. That's the first rule of karma. It's definite, that everything that you experience that is happiness came from a seed that was positive, something that you planted through your own good mental, verbal, physical actions. So if you look at it from that point of view, every time you have something that's good and delightful in your life, it's sort of taking out a bit of that merit, taking another withdrawal from our merit account. But if we just simply use it as a source of more delusion, we get more attached to it, we get bent out of shape when something happens, the air conditioning unit doesn't work. Well, I hope that doesn't happen to you, but you know, you go home and it's not working quite as well or whatever. All these various things that can get in the way of that. If we get bent out of shape by that and we just have more delusion on the basis of those things, then we've really wasted it. But if we experience that and say, you're sitting there, at night and enjoying that, it's cool air coming from the air conditioning unit, and you can think about sending that out to others, thinking about all the hell beings that would love to have an air conditioning unit in their hell realm, or whatever, or even just the beings in the human realm that are dealing with unbelievable heat and, the fires in California. Imagine like sending that out and relieving the suffering of not just the humans that have their houses being endangered, but the animals that are having their whole habitat destroyed or whatever. Well, then you make that into a very positive cause to continue to have the good conditions that are useful for you to continue to be able to do that. But if we have all these good things in our lives and we don't make any use of them at all, well, then that's, kind of wasted to a large degree. So, again, having the cognizance that this is a form of dukkha is to help us to not be so caught up in it, so bound up in like, oh, if I just keep my life like this. As I was saying, in the West, we've gotten very good about sort of filling in the gaps. Always something to go to. I mean, now it's like 24/7. You can do whatever. You can turn on your Netflix and watch anything you want to watch, and you can order food, and you can have all this stuff, and you can be fulfilling that sort of sensory desire all the time with something that'll induce pleasure. And you might think, well, wow, I lived a really good life. I had all this great happy experiences. Or you put your bucket list together as you get older, and you end up going out to all these various things and bungee jumping or doing whatever it is that you've always wanted to do. But you just kind of, again, what have you done with that? You really haven't made anything that important. It's not leading you out of suffering. It's actually encouraging more suffering. So I guess there's a couple of different ways to approach it. You know, uh, Again, I always say that I myself measure the degree to which I'm attached to something by the degree to which I'm bent out of shape when I don't have it. you know and so I think that is a general rule, is that if we find that, okay, we come home, we've had the air conditioning in our house for a long time and the air conditioning breaks, well then we can see, yes, it does induce some discomfort. Without a doubt, you have the first type of dukkha. You have the physical discomfort of being sweaty and hot and whatever and not really being comfortable. But if mentally you're also getting really bent out of shape and you're getting really volatile and angry at everybody and you can't, well then you've probably got a lot of attachment to your air conditioner. And so you need to maybe keep that in check. Recognize that it's great to have an air conditioner, but if a lot of people lived many, many, many centuries without air conditioning. So I don't know. I mean, these are the thoughts that go through my head when I kind of entertain that second type of dukkha, is just to recognize the fleeting nature of all of that and be grateful that you have those things, but also try to use them in a constructive way. But see that they really aren't the measure of a good life. They aren't what we should be putting all of our attention into and trying to have round the clock, pleasure and satisfaction. I don't know. Does that help a little?
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you so much, Don.
Oh, you're welcome, Heather. Yeah, it's hard in this world, though. Venerable Rabina uses the phrase that we're like junkies born into a world of junk. Like everything's, we come from a place of like craving and desire, and everything around us just seems to give us something. We find out, we seek out, and we get this and we get that, and it's all to satisfy, and it doesn't really satisfy. That's the trick. if we can experience those things and do something more meaningful with them. There was one time, I'll share a little story. This is maybe a little off track of looking at suffering and compassion, but Venerable Rabina was here doing teaching. And she does normally, the whole weekend thing, just like she does with you guys, I'm sure, when she's there physically. And so we got to close to the end of the one day, and it was a Sunday. This was years ago when Downton Abbey was on TV, and I really liked Downton Abbey. I mean, I like those masterpiece kinds of period dramas and what have you. And so we were talking in the class about how there's joyous enthusiasm. She was going through the six perfections and this joyous effort, which is the fourth of the perfections. One of the ways that we sort of keep that joy sometimes is by this power that they call relinquishment, which it means sort of letting the work go so we can replenish ourselves, so we can acknowledge that we're not automatons that just keep going, 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 going on the path and never needing any kind of break or any way of renewing our energy. And so I was bringing up to Venerable Rabina how, this is a sort of a slippery slope. You start indulging in things and thinking you're doing something to help you replenish your strength. And suddenly, you've been doing it for a lot longer than what you should have been. But I was telling her how I wanted to go home. And, I was thinking, sure, I've been through this whole wonderful weekend with Venerable Rabina, but I was looking forward to just going home, putting on PBS, and just having my little hour or so of just chilling out. And she says, well, Don, there's no problem with doing that, but you're going to do it with bodhicitta. You're not going to do it at all. And so that's kind of this idea that we have to bring something positive to those experiences. We have to kind of even think about bodhicitta motivation for eating a meal or for, going on a walk or for doing whatever we do, something that infuses that action with some positive thought, and of course, bodhicitta is the most positive thought you can have. We're going to get into this afternoon. Um, so it's a very powerful motivation to transform all of that. So while you're experiencing the air conditioning or whatever the case might be, have your acknowledgement, your awareness through that sort of middle scope teaching that this is not the be all and end all of existence. This isn't, what I really want to do is make sure I just stay comfortable this whole life. you know Instead, can I use at a Mahayana level the great scope kind of teachings, what I'm experiencing as happiness as a means of generating the wish to benefit others, generating the wish for them to experience that happiness, and so on. So again, we have to kind of work where we are, but nonetheless, that's a very important teaching that I took to heart when she said that. I can't say I'm, 100% of the time I've always done that, but it's always in the back of my mind. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of tea here. Is that whole idea that I need to make sure that anything I'm engaging in that is a pleasurable experience, that I think to some degree about doing that with positive motivation. Otherwise, again, you're wasting that. It just becomes a sensory experience that increases our attachment probably, or becomes just a fleeting thing that, we just waste all of that merit. We've just taken a withdrawal and we've not gotten anything for our money. Yeah, Catherine, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to share Heather's story reminded me of something recently. My family is Italian, and so food is like our happiness and source of relief from pain. When I was a kid, that was pretty much what you got, a reward, something that you needed. It was just food was always the answer. So when I cook now, I cook Italian food, I think like, oh, I'm connecting with my family and that's so great. But then recently, with COVID, I've been trying to support more businesses. And so I went to a new place to get homemade pasta and I was really excited. I thought about it for a whole day and I planned what I was going to get. And then when I got it, it was terrible. And I remember being so upset and like angry about how this pasta tasted. And that's when I realized that I had an excessive attachment. It was a little bit over the top.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with attachment, is it does lead, part of it is the expectation, and that we think, we imbue things with qualities that may or may not be there. And in this case, they weren't there, you know. So then it can be really upsetting. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, food is a big one for a lot of people. And again, I talked about food the other night when we were talking about the pandemic and all that. That became like my first sort of comfort thing to do in the midst of all of this. I also like music, so I would put on music frequently. But you have to watch, yeah, our minds around these things, because we can overlay so much stuff that is really, again, completely from our side. It's just little bits of stuff that are put together, and I don't know. It's interesting. Thank you for sharing that, both of you. Yeah, these were good comments. Anything else on this whole idea? And I know you've heard I would guess every one of you has heard these teachings about the three levels of dukkha or suffering before, but I always, feel like it's such a refreshing teaching in terms of something that we need to be reminded of, because we do fall into that trap, like Catherine saying, where suddenly, you put all of your onus on, oh, this has got to be perfect, this is going to be wonderful, and da, 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 and then you get disappointed in the face of that. But if we have an expectation already that, or lack of expectation that things are just going to be what they're going to be, then we're maybe not so caught up in all of it. There's that story of the Taoist farmer that I use frequently when I'm talking about this. Maybe you've heard this before, of the farmer who has a horse and the horse runs away. And so the neighbor that day, when the horse is gone, he comes over and he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry that your horse ran away. How awful, how terrible." And the farmer, practicing this sort of Taoist equilibrium kind of way of being, says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And then the next day, his horse returns with a wild horse. And the next door neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, how wonderful. You've got two horses now. Your horse came back, but with another horse." And the farmer says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And then the next day, his son is out there trying to break the wild horse so he can ride it. And he falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And so then the neighbor comes over and is like, "Oh, I feel so bad for you. Your son broke his leg." And of course, who knows what's good or bad. And then the fourth day, and that's the end of it. I won't be going on for like a year of this. But anyway, the fourth day, uh, the military come through town, recruiting young people to go off to war, and his son is left behind because he has a broken leg. So the neighbor comes over and again says the same thing. "How wonderful, that your son is here and doesn't have to go off to war." And he says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And I don't know what happened after that. That's where the story usually ends. But it gives us a feeling for, can we live our lives like that? Kind of not getting too caught up in it. Of course, and we see, once more, I mentioned this teaching on impermanence yesterday. Impermanence is really behind and at play, all the time. Things constantly changing. I mean, how many of us were really mentally prepared for what transpired with this pandemic? We kind of went along our lives and we made that assumption. We had that in our minds that every day was going to continue to flow like the previous ones. We were going to continue to go to work, continue to do this, to do that. I had all my travel lined up and everything for this year. I had everything. And even, a month or two into it, I was still thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll still be able to travel. Maybe this will still be able to happen. And that's because we get really caught up in kind of needing things to go our way and wanting them to go our way. But we don't know. And I pointed out, I did a little talk for another center recently on the pandemic and all of this. And this could actually be an amazing thing for the human race, as sad as it is that many people have suffered from this and lost lives from this. Maybe this will be the wake-up call that we need, to bring people together, to recognize that we can't keep living in this sort of isolationist mentality and thinking that we'll just take care of ourselves. This America First thing that's been propounded by our current president flies in the face of these sorts of realities, that we are connected with each other, we are involved with each other. We need to embrace the interdependence of this world and not deny it, just as we're seeing in climate change and other things that the people on this planet are facing. So anyway, we don't know what comes from all this. Who knows what's good or bad? We put that label on it, but it's just a label, just a thought. All right. Wow, my camera's gotten really out of focus here. I'm not sure why that is. Sometimes I find if I unplug it and plug it back in, it corrects itself. Let me do that right now. Hopefully it'll pick it up. Yeah, that's a little bit better, it seems. Wow, it's kind of doing its thing. I don't know what it's doing. There it is. Okay. If there are no other questions, let's go ahead and get back into the instruction on compassion, which is what we were going to finish off with this morning. Make sure that we get that done. Back on suffering, of course, you can work with any of these ideas in terms of the beings that you are focusing on, initially yourself, but of course, others. When we get back to the instruction, we'll see that we're going to direct our compassionate thoughts towards others. Sometimes it's useful to reflect on these 6 types of suffering, or faults of samsara. They're sometimes called in the text. The uncertainty that I mentioned the other night when we talked about working with fear. being dissatisfied. Dissatisfaction is kind of an undercurrent again to a lot of this. Repeatedly leaving bodies, going off to another existence, and then being conceived and born over and over again when we get into that new existence. So we have to leave behind this body and this existence and everything that it's entailed with that and go on to another one. Then moving from high to low over and over again. We've been in every possible realm of existence, from the lowest of the low to the highest of the high. And this is just, what it's like. We just keep going, all bouncing around in various samsaric states. And this is an interesting one, the suffering of having no companion, fundamentally being alone. No matter what we do, we like to think, oh, well, I've got people in my life and what have you, I'm not alone. But we really are alone. we cannot really be with others in the sort of ideal way of knowing their thoughts, being in their hearts in a genuine, true, way. Instead, we go through our lives completely alone, and we leave this life alone. And, the people are around us, but we don't really have something that is kind of with us in the end. We're sort of by ourselves. The 8 types of suffering this was what the Buddha set out in the first sutra, the Four Noble Truths Sutra. The suffering of birth, aging, illness, and death. These 4 are kind of the experiences that beings go through, particularly in this human realm, that we are born, and that's an experience we don't remember, and it's probably really good that we don't remember. It was probably fairly traumatic. And then age, that sometimes aging feels good. When you're young, maybe it feels good to get a little bit older and, be able to do things that you weren't able to do when you were younger. But as the body continues to age, we find out that aging is not a lot of fun. Illness, death, these are the realities of existence. Then the suffering of being separated from the pleasant, the beautiful things we have, the suffering of meeting with the ugly or the unpleasant, the suffering of seeking the things we desire but not finding them, being thwarted in getting them, and then the suffering of the contaminated aggregates, which is kind of like the pervasive condition suffering, the reality that we continue to appropriate again and again. These aggregates, the mental and physical components of a being that kind of are within an existence, and then we let go of that existence when we die, and we go on and we appropriate another set of contaminated aggregates. And as long as we are together with contaminated aggregates, contaminated because they're together with the causes of dukkha, ignorance, and so on, then we are going to experience some level of suffering. And then the specific sufferings of the various realms of samsara. So these are what Rinpoche often does. If you've read any of Rinpoche's books, sometimes when he gets into the compassion meditations or the Tonglen meditations, where you're working with taking away the sufferings of beings, he has you visualize, the hell beings and the pratas, the hungry ghosts, the animals, the human beings, the demigods, the gods, and work with each of these realms individually. That can also be done, but we've been in every one of these realms. Of course, we're in the human realm right now, and we can identify with the reality that we've experienced ourselves, every one of those forms of suffering. We don't recall it. We don't have the ability. Through the obscurations in our own mind, we're incapable of remembering those. But nonetheless, we can apply these to ourselves, but certainly we can apply this to a way of looking at other beings. So maybe I don't need to say so much more about that. Again, there's references to liberation in the palm of your hand for those if you want to, go further into that. Let's go back to, this was again, the first part had to do with cultivating compassion for ourselves, and trying to do that with the recognition of our own suffering. Now we go on to cultivating compassion for the 3 groups, the friends, strangers, and enemies. And I, again, think this is the traditional advice that's given around the Lam Rim instruction, is that we do work in that very methodical way. I mentioned this yesterday, right? Start with the person who you feel maybe the closest to, who you feel is like the dearest friend, because that proximity to them makes it the easiest to generate compassionate thoughts. Then you bring into your meditation like the next person that would be next in line, and then next in line after that. And you keep working with people who are in this kind of a group of friends, dear ones, people that we already feel close to. And that helps us to have an opening of our hearts at the same level for every one of those beings that's in that group before we go on to the groups that we don't know as well. And then you would work with strangers. And again, you can't possibly work with every single stranger that exists in this world. It's just not going to be feasible. You probably can't even work with every person that you consider to be a friend. But you work with enough of them so that you gain an appreciation for their state of suffering and a desire to be involved in helping to relieve their suffering to some degree, or at least to wish it to be, absent, to not be there. And then finally, you get to the enemies. Now, I know I have, didn't say this yesterday, but I'll mention it today. Some people have told me that they find it harder to work with strangers than with enemies, because the strangers are nameless people, just beings out there that we really don't have much connection to. But I do think there's some benefit to working with strangers before the difficult people, because the difficult people, again, although we do know them and we can conjure them up, we have a lot of baggage with them. We have a lot of stuff that makes it harder to open our hearts to them, because especially when we look at this tendency that we have of actually rejoicing in the misfortune of those people. No, and it's very hard to do, to avoid that. In our everyday world, where we're hearing through the media so many things about the people that we dislike in a public venue, like, the politicians or whoever in the world that we don't feel that we're in line with, that we feel are doing things that are harmful, that we have some animosity towards. We hear that they get thwarted in this, the courts rule against them, or somebody says something bad about them, or whatever the case might be. And it's very easy for us to take joy in that. To not really see how much this being is a suffering being. So I think we've got too much baggage with the enemies, the difficult people, to go right to them after our friends. The strangers are a bit of a safe ground for us to work with, opening our hearts to those whose situations we don't know, but at least help us to advance our compassion beyond those people that we feel some kinship with already. Now, again, hopefully our kinship with all of them will have been influenced to some degree by those thoughts of their kindness that we cultivated in immeasurable love, right? We spent a fair amount of time yesterday afternoon looking at the ways that beings are kind to us. If we can bring that feeling of closeness as well into this meditation, and that's one of the points that we're going to see here, that does really help. In fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in his book, An Open Heart, he talks about how, in his view, and maybe I haven't seen a traditional teaching that spells it out this way, though it's obvious it's part of it, there are two main factors that are essential for us to have compassion for others. One is certainly to see clearly their suffering. That's why I spent some time just going through the list of all the ways that beings are suffering. And some of those might be more effective with some people or even with ourselves than others are. But nonetheless, we can begin to gain an appreciation for their suffering. That's an essential part of having compassion. You have to see that person as suffering or as having something unsatisfactory going on. Otherwise, your compassion's completely missing, right? Doesn't matter any other thoughts. If you don't think that they're having any level of suffering or dissatisfaction, then why would you generate compassion for them? So even the person who has the greatest riches in this world as a human being, or even those beings that are born into the God realms, for example, that have unbelievable good fortune through their good karma to just have a life where they don't experience any great physical pain or anything. They just kind of coast. you know, those beings are still in samsara. They're still dealing with, pervasive condition suffering, if nothing else. So the reality is we have to understand the extent to which beings are suffering to have compassion for them. But the second point that His Holiness makes, that is sort of that empathic connection, the ability for us to feel close to other beings, to open our hearts to them. Oftentimes that's where we have some greater difficulty. How do our hearts open to those people who we see causing harm in this world or causing harm to us? That's a much more challenging thing to do. But if we feel some closeness to them through recognizing their kindness, recognizing that we need those difficult people in our lives, and we understand where their difficulty comes from. We know that that being is not inherently evil. You have a lot of people in this world who've done a lot of heinous, horrible things, but they're not inherently evil. They have Buddha nature like everyone else. So if we can muster up some feeling of connection to that person, some feeling of closeness and affection for that person, that's what will be the real difference. Having the understanding of their suffering is one thing, but feeling kind of compelled to do something about it or to feel compassion for them involves some feeling of closeness, some affection for that being. So this is also, again, hopefully by inserting these two sub-meditations in here for immeasurable love, to look at the kindness of others so we do feel like they are involved in our welfare. Even those people who are directly harmful to us, those enemies, those difficult people, they are involved in our welfare because they give us the opportunity, again, to practice patience and loving kindness and so on in the face of those who harm us. You're never going to become a Buddha without developing your patience to that degree. Therefore, you need those people. They're showing you a kindness. That's, in the loving kindness meditate, or in the immeasurable love meditation, I threw that in there so we could feel that sense of closeness and affection for others. And then over here in compassion, we look at the reality of how beings are suffering. Because even as I just said, the person who's in the most ideal situation samsarically is still in samsara, is still in an unsatisfactory state. So anyway, I'm pointing out that these two motivations are kind of necessary for our compassion to be complete. So let's go back to the instruction and see how that unfolds there. So it says here, start with friends, move on to strangers or neutral people, finally work with enemies, those with whom you have a difficult relationship. Recall the meditation on equanimity to generate an even-mindedness towards all three categories. Of course, that was also in the loving kindness, measurable love meditation, was that we need to recall equanimity. Equanimity, until you have it in a deeper realization, you're going to need to bring it to mind whenever you do any of these other meditations. Then extend compassion to each of these three groups by recalling the ways that they suffer, which we just went through in the second addendum, and then also recalling their kindness to generate a heartfelt connection to them. Again, if you have both of those components there, as His Holiness says, then you can open the heart with compassion because you see them as a suffering being and you feel for them. You do have some empathy for them, some heart connection with them because they've been intimately involved in your welfare. Then wish for them to be free from suffering and its causes in a similar way as when working with oneself. And kind of like what I did in the meditation today when we did the meditation on loving kindness, I think it's perfectly fine to like pull one person from each group rather than working with big kind of groups of people. As I mentioned yesterday, the more you generalize things, Lama Tsongkhapa says, the more that it becomes potentially a lot weaker because you need the specifics, you need the specific beings to work with. And sometimes like what we did this morning in terms of the loving kindness meditation with three beings, one friend, one stranger, one enemy. Well, that's really useful things because it kind of shows to some degree where we're stuck. Where did the love flow most naturally? Where did we feel most comfortable extending those thoughts and that warming energy of loving kindness to those beings? It was probably with our friends. Maybe the strangers, it was still a little bit charged there. But when you got to the difficult people, maybe there was a bit of that resistance of like, do I really feel like sending this out to that person? It's the same with compassion, so it's nice if you can even start with working with, again, in the natural order, as I pointed out before, is stick with friends for a while till you feel like you have that same level of compassion you have for your dearest friend, for all of your friends. Then move on to the strangers and work with them, and then move on to the enemies, the difficult people. But nothing wrong with doing what I did this morning of kind of pulling one from each group to be a sort of test to see how freely does it flow towards beings in each of those categories. But work mostly with individuals. It's nice to do these bigger meditations like Rinpoche suggests of thinking of all hell beings. We can't even imagine how many hell beings they are. They say that these realms of samsara, the large preponderance of beings, the greater number of beings is in the lower realms. I mean, even if you look at our planet right now, we've got 8 billion, almost 8 billion, 7 point some billion human beings on this planet. We think that there's so many human beings, but my gosh, there are so many other beings in the waters, in the air, on the land, wherever. I was, pointing out the other night, I think, that how many ants are just in a backyard here in New Mexico over the summer. I mean, so many that I just can't even imagine, and those beings, they go down under the ground in the winter, but they're still there. But we have so many beings just in one little place that outnumber the few human beings that are living on this area, where I live in Santa Fe. So those realms are almost impossible to imagine. To think about all sentient beings, it becomes a bit nebulous. And nothing wrong there too with working with individual hell beings. You don't know a particular hell being because you're not in the hell state right now. But you can think about somebody who's left this life, who did really horrible things with that life, somebody like Pol Pot or Adolf Hitler or whoever, and you can think about them in a hell form going through all of that and trying to generate some compassionate thoughts towards them. But you can also, as Rinpoche says, think about all the hell beings. But just know that the more general it gets in my mind, as I said, the more nebulous it seems, the more that we don't really have the sort of power behind it sometimes. But over time, hopefully we will. As we work with more and more individuals, then we can extend it out to larger groups and have the same measure of compassionate thought or loving kindness thought towards all of them. So that's my little advice on how to work with it in terms of the three categories. We can, as I was just pointing out, go on to extending compassion for all sentient beings. You can do that by first recalling the many ways that they are suffering, also recalling the many ways that they are kind, because again, every being fits into a category of friend, enemy, or stranger, so they've all been kind to us in some way. We can also recall how they've all been friends, enemies, and strangers in different lifetimes and have done different things for us at different times, so we can feel that affection, that kindness towards all beings. Of course, this when we get to the bodhicitta motivation, we're going to look at that, which many of you have already heard before, of seeing all sentient beings as having been your mother, having been in a very intimate role of helping you, your dearest friend and dearest companion in the parts of your life where you were most vulnerable. So again, with an understanding of all their suffering through all those points, an understanding of how they have been kind to us and we can feel close to them, we can then cultivate immeasurable compassion with the prayer. And you can, of course, meditate within this prayer. You can do the first line, which is that sort of huge aspiration, wish, how wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And then may they be free from suffering and its causes, elevating that to a prayer. And then thinking, I myself will do this. I will cause others to be free from suffering and all the causes of that. And then once more invoking whoever it is that you see as sort of the source of this. Can be again four-armed Chenrezig, thousand-armed Chenrezig, Buddha Shakyamuni, Green Tara. It can be just again visualizing your own guru in the form that they are manifesting for you. But if you think about the Buddhas, then think about your guru as also being there. And if you think about the guru, think about the Buddhas as also being there. But receive the blessings of these holy beings so that you can actually accomplish this. It's an important part of it, our making supplications and receiving the blessings is how it happens to some degree. This is a way that the Buddhas are very effective in our lives. They can't remove all of our suffering and make us have perfect realizations just by being in our lives in that way, but they can be a great source of inspiration and support. I think that's all for compassion. Let me see if there are any questions now. Again, kind of opening it up to any questions or comments. Because we're at, let's see, 11:51. Is everyone okay with just a little bit longer break? I don't know what else to do during this time. I can start talking about immeasurable joy, but it's just going to be something I'm going to have to repeat in the afternoon probably. So I'll just do a really quick review of what we talked about already. Then again, we spent some time on immeasurable equanimity yesterday morning after having introduced the four immeasurables, talked about why they're immeasurable and so on, and worked a bit with developing that mind that is very even towards all beings. What was the phrase? I actually didn't share this phrase with you from one of the teachings. They say equal but not identical is the way we want to be looking at beings there. And that's because, once more, we're not talking about changing these categories that they're in, because there are some people who are friends, there are people who are strangers, there are people who are enemies or difficult people. We're not talking about modifying that. They're not identical, but they are equal. They're equally deserving of all the additional thoughts we're going to generate, because they're all fundamentally the same in a variety of ways. Then we went on to immeasurable love, which, as we meditated on this morning, was about opening our heart by reflecting on one aspect of beings, which is the fact that they want to be happy, they deserve to be happy, and we want that for them, primarily because we see that they've been very kind to us, and so the thoughts towards them should begin to arise more naturally when we see the kindness we've experienced from others. And then today we went through immeasurable compassion, where we looked at the flip side of that, sort of the companion thought that is responding to the suffering of others. the fact that other beings are in unsatisfactory existences and so on, and experiencing the variety of things that we went through in our list of the types of suffering. And then we generate the feeling of closeness to them again that allows us to extend that compassionate thought towards them. So what we're going to do in this afternoon is then to go on to immeasurable joy, which is actually the shortest of these 4 to go through, because it just doesn't seem that there's as much to talk about as there is in the others, but there's some things that we can talk about. Oh, I know one thing I forgot about compassion. Before we have our lunch break, I have to share the near and far enemies of compassion. We didn't talk about that. I may not even have time for that now that I think about it. Before we do that, though, I want to share one little quote that comes from Kunu Lama Rinpoche, which you may have heard of him. He was actually one of His Holiness's teachers. He taught him the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, the Shantideva's text, and he wrote a book called In Praise of Bodhicitta. But he says it's this simple or that simple. Whoever we encounter did either realize reality or did not. In other words, they've realized the nature of things at the deepest level or they haven't. This is true, right? Anyone we meet, any being that we see, has either realized emptiness or they haven't. If they did, they stand on their own wisdom and are objects of veneration. If they did not, they are immersed in suffering and are objects of compassion. Thus, nobody is a valid object of anger or derogation, and nobody can ever be abandoned from our hearts. I like that quote because it's, again, kind of speaking to a very basic way of looking at it. Any being you meet is falling into one category or the other. If they've realized emptiness, you should prostrate to them. If they haven't realized emptiness, have compassion for them. Yeah. Anger isn't called for in either case. Therefore, in any case, the far enemy of compassion, real quickly, is cruelty. I don't think I need to talk about this so much. That's, like I said yesterday, when your heart is so armored that you can be cruel to other beings. You can inflict harm on other beings. You can be like, Vinnie Ferraro and beat people with baseball bats and what have you, before he sort of found the light. The near enemies are pity and a grief or overwhelm, which literally the term that's used in Tibetan, I believe, it would translate as horrified anxiety. So let's talk briefly about pity. Pity is something that could be very easily mistaken for compassion. But when I use the word pity here, and I mean pity in a dictionary sense maybe doesn't have all this connotation, but the connotation here is that pity is more coming from a place of superiority, kind of like, oh, you poor person down there suffering, I feel so bad for you. I feel great pity for you. But you don't think of yourself on the same level. That's, again, contrary to what we did in our meditation, right? Because we first saw our own suffering, and then we can see that we're at the same level of others. And although their individual situation might look very different, we can come at that with an equal understanding of the way that all beings are suffering. Pity doesn't have that. Pity has a condescending kind of tone to it. The second one is maybe the one to pay more attention to, which is a sort of grief or sense of overwhelm. I was mentioning this earlier when we talked about, when the coronavirus first started taking root and you started seeing things from other countries even, seeing what was going on in Italy and the shots from the hospitals there. Of course, I have a bit of a connection with Italy due to having spent those 7 years studying over there. And, was hearing from my friends over there and what was going on. And it was pretty horrific, and to open up to that, you can sometimes feel like your heart's open to it, but it's so heavy. You feel so overwhelmed. Well, this too is not quite hitting the target. That's why when Venerable Rabina teaches about compassion, she frequently uses this idea of courageous compassion. Courageous compassion is acknowledging the pain and the difficulty that's going on in the world or that's going on in our own lives, but it's a very active mind that is intent upon doing something about that. So it's not getting bogged down in the overwhelm. In I've done some courses that I'm qualified to teach through the FDCW. They've kind of taken this bigger course that was called The Art of Fulfillment, and they put it into little modules now. And I'm qualified to train or to teach the one module, which is on empathy. When we talk about empathy, you can have empathy that becomes overwhelming because you are in a deeper space of affective empathy and not using the cognitive empathy. In other words, you're mostly in your heart and you're not in your head so much. You're not thinking about that other person in terms of that still being their suffering and it requiring you to perhaps not take it on as your own completely. You have to be able to feel the suffering of another through that affective empathy. But if it doesn't have a cognitive component, then this is where overwhelm happens. In fact, in some writings that I've read, they say that in the caring traditions, as I mentioned earlier, where people seem to not be able to continue sometimes because it becomes overwhelming for them, it's because their empathy's gotten more out of balance rather than their compassion. It's not compassion burnout, it's empathy burnout, because they are too much in that affective side of it. And I'm sure it's hard for these people, especially we look at our caring profession that are dealing with so much suffering right now in the hospitals. They're with those people day in and day out. Sometimes they're the only people with them. Their family members, again, can't even come into the room. And so they're needing to be with them in the space of their suffering in ways that are pretty unusual. But they have to still have that cognitive empathy that understands that this is still that person's experience. And their job there is to help address the reality of things that are going on, not get lost in the suffering. Anyway, this whole kind of near enemy of compassion that we call overwhelm is a frequent one that happens, right? People begin to open their hearts to the suffering of the world and they shut down because it just becomes too much. That's where you need kind of that cognitive component, the understanding that it doesn't have to be this way in the end. Yes, this is what beings are going through now, but things are changeable. Things can be resolved through, the power of the Buddha's teachings and so on. Bringing that kind of understanding into it often helps to do away with some of the overwhelm. So maybe we'll talk about this more if you need to after we have our lunch break, but now I've talked up to the lunch break, and so we're just going to have our hour as usual. So let's just do some thoughts of dedication before we conclude for our lunch break, just thinking very strongly through the force of what we've done these past 2 hours. May this also contribute to our own enlightenment and thus to the enlightenment of all beings. And again, enjoy your food, do your offering prayer, whatever it is that you normally do, and try to, as you're partaking of that and enjoying the pleasure of that, think about sending that out to others, making some good use of that, identifying with the others in the world who don't have food, who are suffering from hunger and so on, and doing what you can through your own thought process to alleviate the suffering of others as you partake of your food. And we'll can reconvene at 1. And again, any questions or comments on what I've just talked about, we'll open with that. I don't know if we'll have time for meditation this afternoon or not. We'll just have to see how it goes. All right. Have a wonderful lunch break, and I'll see you in an hour. Bye.